Sociology as Political Education by Karl Mannheim. Section 8. The Contemporary Tasks of Sociology. Cultivation and the Curriculum. The portion translated below represents about one-half of the brochure published in Mannheim by Mannheim. Sociology as Political Education. Chapter 8. The Contemporary Tasks of Sociology. Cultivation and the Curriculum. The portion translated below represents about one-half of the brochure published by Mannheim, containing the text of his presentation to a meeting of all teachers of sociology in Germany on February 29, 1932. While the struggle over sociology had earlier been about the recognition of the discipline and the appointment of new professors, the economic conditions made the latter issue irrelevant, and transmuted the former into a question of securing enough students when cognate disciplines promised more vocational benefit and required strict adherence to extensive requirements. Reluctantly, the sociology teachers spoke of the need to come closer to the guild practices of other disciplines, beginning with the delineation of examinable disciplinary boundaries and qualifications. The leading professors, notably von Weiss, Mannheim, and Fryer. The leading professors agreed on certain common formulas for transmitting their demands to the education authorities, but Mannheim, as host, used the occasion to develop an expansive rationale and program for the discipline. He says that his aim is not to put forward the, quote, sociology that can alone save our souls, end quote, but to answer the questions about, quote, the contents that should be offered to university students in what pedagogical didactic form, end quote. The present selection covers the principles that should determine the choice of subject matter. In the brochure, it is preceded by a classification of sociological subjects, which marks some advance on Mannheim's 1930 scheme. As specialized discipline, sociology may be taught in an unhistorical axiomatic manner, like von Weiss, and in a comparative typological form, like Max Weber, and in a historical individualizing manner, which Mannheim says must, quote, crown the others. Sociology is also available as an approach to the subject matter of other disciplines, including not only literature and law, but also knowledge as cultural objectification. The third grand category of sociology, according to Mannheim, is sociology as a quote, sociology as a teaching about the total interconnectedness of social spiritual happenings, or cultural sociology, end quote. Sociography and current studies also belong to sociology. Mannheim's point is that all these forms are legitimately part of the discipline, and that their integration should be governed by the principles discussed below. The question is, what should we select from the wealth of sociological materials available to us as teachers? What principles should govern our choice? We must pose this question with a full sense of our responsibility. As historians and sociologists, we realize that the original constellation of a science shapes its later form, and that its teaching form, above all, tends to work back on its scientific one. So, philosophy and the human sciences in Germany are strongly marked by the constellation of their origins, which was given form by Romanticism and Historicism at the beginning of the 19th century. Both the positive and negative qualities of the historicist romantic approach still characterize the definition of problems in the human sciences. The limits placed on the formative questions of the human sciences, as well as on the concurrent philosophical design, still constrain today's fabric of inquiry, and without anyone intending it, things have been left where the earlier generation too remained unable to advance. The conceptual forms that emerged then will still long determine what can penetrate these disciplines from the empirical realm and what these same concepts necessarily conceal. The simple fact that Romanticism in Germany discovered history but not society, and the spirit but not the meaning of the concrete empirical psyche, with all its hidden paths and evasions, continues to mark our human scientific research, which even today, in keeping with this angle of approach, only knows two basic concepts, spirit and historicity. As a result, it obscures all of the issues that French sociology has worked out ever more acutely for itself and for related disciplines as well, i.e., the life of society and its significance for the psychological construction of concrete social human types, or putting it a little more simply, the power of conditions to shape human beings. Even today, almost all of the official German ontology and epistemology remains enthralled by this particular approach, for which historicity and spirit exist, but not concrete human beings in their social and natural situations, with empirically observable ways of behaving. Approaches of this kind are simply dismissed as shallow positivism and as belonging to the natural sciences. As much fruitful matter as this approach may have extracted from the historicity of all human happenings, as fruitfully synthetic as it is possible to operate with the concept of spirit, insofar as it is a question of working out interconnections that extend beyond the particular existence of the individual and that concern works and objectifications, just as much is this approach to problems blind, even today, when it comes to a question of ascertaining the most elementary state of facts, and of working out the significance of social group life for spirit and history. Interestingly, the gift for empirical observation fails at this point, no less than do methodological reflection and the positing of ontological grounds. Insofar as anything at all was said about such matters in the course of German development, it originated with the extra-academic opposition, which built upon French or English approaches to these problems, as was already the case with Lorenz v. Stein, Marx, and later Nietzsche. This shows how decisive the starting point and initial problem formation can be for the future fate of a science. If today there is an awakening of demand for the inclusion of the sociological point of view in the posing of problems in the human sciences, this too has a sociological cause. This desire does not simply emerge from the imminent development of human scientific inquiry, but is rather a reflection of the fact that the extra-academic circles, for whom the sociological approach first became urgent, are encroaching ever more in the academic sphere. This is happening in proportion to the contacts and exchanges taking place in public life between them, and the traditional representatives of official science. The categories and angles of observation of the two groups of thinkers are also ever more in the process of mutual penetration. This suffices to make it clear that more than methodological considerations are at issue, and that in this situation of a new beginning it is necessary to possess, as far as possible, express criteria for ruling and regulating the selection of subject matter. We are at present more concerned with a clear derivation of these criteria of selection than with their concrete implementation. The concrete program can always be modified in the light of experience and adjusted to situations, to the extent that one has first succeeded in developing points of view and guidelines. These points of view and guidelines, to which we now turn, do not simply express the purely theoretical requirements of sociology. They are gained rather from an analysis of the general situation which needs sociology as teaching subject is supposed to satisfy in the present stage of development. In this sense, we distinguish three groups of demands affecting the selection of subject matter and the pedagogical shaping of sociology. A. Demands of the present general state of society. B. Demands from the present condition of the academic teaching enterprise. And C. Demands arising from the present condition of the research enterprise, from the general situation in science. A. Demands from the state of society. The rise of the sociological orientation to life appears to be obviously connected to the spread of the democratic social order. As the bourgeois citizen gains a right of co-determination in government, as compared to the political order of princely absolutism, it seems to become ever more important in the same measure to place him in a position to make an intelligent judgment of the political social interconnections among events. What the bourgeoisie originally captured for itself alone gradually becomes common property of a spreading social democracy. The fact observable at the same time that dictatorships may very easily arise out of these democracies does not speak against this insight of an ever more radical democratization of politics. Modern dictatorship is itself democratic, if also only in this respect, because it too must be supported by the masses. It is not imposed from above by the prince or some oligarchy, but it has had to be at least tolerated since its inception by the masses. At our level of development, this tacit consensus of passivity arises on the basis of the inclusion in principle of all citizens in political life. What is new is exactly that in the modern age, the integration of wills can be set in motion from below. Notably, the ruled are not originally passive in the modern age, but only through neutralization of their previously awakened activity. If one does not want this reality, this constitutive universal aliveness of modern society, to lead from a democracy of reason to a democracy of feeling, in which the great majority acts only under the sway of momentary feelings, it is necessary that democracy must sooner or later be linked to mass enlightenment and schooling, which carries to the broader masses the forms of thinking and orientation that had hitherto been available only to very small ruling circles. The older ruling groups that ruled from on high always possessed some of the Machiavellian calculation that has the courage to consider even the processes of society as calculable sequences, by and large. If society is not to be swamped by anarchy as a result of the mere democracy of feeling, this view and this courage must percolate downward and govern the responsible citizen. What can naturally not be expected from such sociological orientation, from such capacity to reason social and political events through to their conclusions, is the disappearance of conflict of interests. Much would already be achieved, however, if everyone were able to promote his interests properly understood, and by virtue of the same reasoning with which he considers his advantage, to recognize the location of the boundary where his own partial interests are restricted at a given moment by the solidarity interests of the larger group. He must be able at each moment to consider carefully where the boundary lies, the transgressing of which by someone furthering his own demands threatens the existence of the framing group. People who think rationally are calculable, and it is always possible, where they are concerned, to move the frictions arising from a conflict of interest towards a dynamic, constantly renegotiated settlement and equilibrium. In the case of masses and hordes ruled only by feelings and myths, in contrast, the settlements will be achieved only in the manner of blind natural happenings, as happens with certain barbaric primitive people, through the destruction of the two contending sides. As far removed as we may still be from the universal dissemination of the sociological orientation, it has become much more widespread than it was a century ago. Social circles that had no entry to these spheres in earlier generations are now thinking in a political and sociological manner. It is necessary for this ever more widely distributed sociological orientation to become a common possession at a much different tempo than before. The refined social mechanism represented by industrial society cannot function if its operations are constantly interrupted by incursion from the external irrationalities. The democratization of social life, in the widest sense, and especially the democratization of politics, in the sense of the potential co-participation of the broad masses, makes it imperative to subject the latter to sociological civic schooling. This provides a basis for understanding French curricular efforts to create and teach a kind of sociological civics. The more clear the need for a political sociology is shown to be in this context, the more energetically must one try to present these curricular contents to students in as value-free and non-agitational a way as possible. For it would be the death of sociology if it were to become nothing but the agitational instrument of one or more parties. It would be no less damaging, however, if sociology were fastidiously to avoid the political and social topics of life and our current existence from fear of giving offense, and if it were to withdraw, purely out of caution, to heights of abstraction, where, in this respect at least, no harm could befall it. The art of the sociologist consists in talking about themes of the greatest relevance and urgency in a manner such that one communicates everything knowable needed to judge the materials realistically, while also presenting all possible alternative judgments in their proper contexts, so as to put one's own opinions as teacher equally in question. In this regard, the highly instructive dispute about value neutrality in the social sciences has pointed the way to a manner of teaching politics without suggestion and valuation of judgments. And even if the sociology of knowledge has called attention to several complications in this connection, complications that leave every account with a remainder of boundedness to social location, despite full self-denial and evaluation, or, quote, value freedom, it did this not to open the door to every kind of arbitrariness, but precisely for the sake of a still more complete self-regulation and objectivity. Interesting as we may find the attempts to extend our argument about the existential connectedness of thinking by tendencies employing the doctrine to legitimate their ever more questionable principles, we also consider certain conclusions that have been drawn from it to be dangerous. And when this theory goes so far as to give rise to an exaggerated notion that, quote, a will that is true is a warrant for true knowledge, end quote, the door has been opened to every kind of arbitrariness in theory. Who would not step into the intellectual arena armed with the conviction or pretense of a, quote, will that is true, end quote? And who in such a situation would not be pleased to be excused in future from having to make a properly substantiated case and to be permitted instead to invoke his inspiration and genuine conviction? Taken this way, the task imposed by insight into the reality of the existential connectedness of thinking is misdirected, because the insight no longer serves self-criticism, and distantiated from existential bonds as originally intended. Because the insight no longer serves self-criticism and distanciation from existential bonds as originally intended. Instead, it legitimates every conceivable kind of partisanship. On this point, the discussion will have to show the extent to which social scientific knowledge is ever able to master its existential connectedness, the more critical it becomes, and the more aware of its existential ties, thereby increasing its chances of escaping from propagandistic arbitrariness. While sociology arose as an oppositional science, and while it continues to gain its most fruitful insights from its critical posture, it is important to note sociology does not identify with any points of view that are open to it, like socialism. Sociology as such is born out of the conflict among the various collectively asserted attitudes to society, and if one insists on a common denominator to which all of its tendencies can be imputed, one would have to say that sociology is the life orientation appropriate for man in industrial society, leaving open the question whether the society is organized on capitalist or socialist foundations. The courage and the will to subject even lived social space to rational scrutiny first arises at this stage in society. For this society cannot maintain itself in the long term if the individuals comprising it are unable to exercise rational foresight, if they do not learn to act responsibly on the basis of factual diagnoses. This, quote, industrial genesis says nothing, however, about the applicability and validity of a rational view for other ages. A man of industrial society needs a sociological orientation just to make his way as an individual if he wants to pursue a halfway complex, quote, career. As early as a Balzac novel, one of the characters arrives at the insight that it is possible to rise in modern society only if one subjects to meticulous study the laws of society. The Balzacian novels are themselves an attempt to work out such a sociological natural history of civil society. Their special charm, however, to stay with the point for a moment, consists in their sense for the fantastical that is in fact present in this society despite all rationality, or perhaps precisely within this very element of rationality. If it is already true in the case of a problem of individual advancement in a somewhat complex situation that it is necessary to have accurate knowledge of the laws of that life space, the laws that produce the different human types, and their ways of reacting, as well as the arenas in which upward mobility remains possible, then it is still more possible to master the fate of larger collectivities without more or less thoroughgoing knowledge of the total situation in which one is placed while acting. In those areas, one can make decisions only if one can at least calculate the prospects of an action's success. One can err and miscalculate in these diagnoses, and one will do so from time to time, but an action that takes real factors into account possesses a different dignity, and in the long run, a prospect of accomplishing its aims altogether different from an abrupt action that proceeds planlessly, in the fog of myth-making, and that does not, in fact, comprehend reality even if chance should grant it an occasional success. The sociological life orientation of modern man demands, in short, a theory of the total contexts against which the particular and accidental life situation of the specific individual is set off. Because of these most pressing requirements of individual and collective life orientation, it is necessary to teach, alongside of general sociology, which is inevitably too abstract to reach individuals and concrete life situations, a sociological study of current issues. If it were not for the press of life and the sociological problem complex arising out of life situations and oriented to concrete needs, if the matter were viewed strictly from the standpoint of the purely imminent development of science, such current issues studies would have to wait long for its emergence. Setting out from a theoretical general sociology, it would be a long way to the concretizations of problem statements that appear to master unique historical constellations in their individuality from a grounding in the most general. Fortunately, however, the sciences do not develop solely on the basis of theoretical immanence. Rather, they generally receive their most fruitful impulses from the concrete tasks of the historically changing everyday affairs of a community and from the pedagogical requirements, taken in the broadest sense, of the concrete persons who are confronted with specific tasks and the solution of problems specific to collective situations. This matter of inquiry, setting out from two poles, from the needs of practice and the demands of theory, has already acquitted itself very well in the various disciplines of the human and social sciences. It has prevented, on the one hand, that elaboration of pure scholasticism toward which all pure theory tends, but, on the other hand, the evaluation no less of an empiricism devoid of all theory. The development of political economy, for example, is thus fruitfully advanced precisely by virtue of the fact that it moves forward in its tasks from the two poles of theory and practice, and that the two approaches come ever closer to one another. If it is the pedagogical situation above all that compels us to advocate, alongside of general sociology, the development of a sociological study of current issues for the sake of modern man's concrete life orientation, we nevertheless believe that the obligatory tie to the concrete also benefits sociological theory and protects it from excessive formalization and premature scholasticism. Part B. Demands arising from the academic teaching enterprise.